Thank you so much, Fenggang, for that introduction, and thank you to the President, and thank you to the local host, and thank you everybody for coming at the end of busy days or the beginning of busy days. Your conference program looks amazing. I wish I was in Taiwan. I'm going to share my screen now. Have I got the right one?
Yep.
No. Yes?
Yep.
Yes.
Not. Yes? Sure? Not the presenter view? Okay.
Yes.
Good. So, as Fenggang explained, my research interest is about the decline of the churches in Christianity in Western countries particularly, but I'm more interested in what takes the place as that kind of religion declines, what takes over. And my focus in this talk is going to be on values, because I'm writing a book now arguing that values are what has taken over in Western liberal democracies increasingly. And they are playing a lot of the roles that religion and the churches used to play. And I'm very interested to hear from people here if it is similar or different in the parts of the world where you do your research. So my hypotheses, I've got two main hypotheses that I want to try and demonstrate to you. The first is that values have become a kind of new religion, a quasi-religion, and I want to look at how that happened and why that happened. And then I also, secondly, I want to suggest it's not just that values have risen in their profile, but they have also changed, and that a certain set of values associated particularly with Christian teaching have been overlaid or replaced with a new set of values. And just to reiterate, I am talking about post-Christian Western liberal democracies, what Samuel Huntington calls Western countries, i.e. North America, Europe, and Australia, New Zealand. So those English-speaking countries with a particular history and a particular political complexion. And so that's why I'm very interested to see if it's similar or different in your parts of the world. Now, by values, what do I mean? I'm particularly interested in what I'm going to call articulated values. So where the words, the actual words are presented, usually in single words like respect or pride or democracy or integrity or whatever it might be, kindness. This actual word values it didn't used to be used. We used to talk much more about ethics and morality or morals. So the word values itself has become increasingly used in these English-speaking countries. It's a word that actually comes from economics particularly, and it's really starting to be used really synonymously with ethics and morals, but to be used more often. And I think that's because it seems, whereas ethics and morality is often presented as if it's something objective and given, values are more subjective, there's more room for individual choice, and they are relational. So something is valued when I value it, when X esteems Y, or Fenggang values so-and-so. You know, it's a relational and more subjective thing. So we can personalize values, what's particularly important to me or my group. One thing that values obviously do is prioritize. When we value things, we put them up, our priorities for attraction and desire behavior. They're of course very vague. The values like respect, pride are extremely vague things when you try and pin them down, or even if you try and define values, it's very hard to do. And I suspect this is part of their appeal, that they are so open textured. Well, there's already a plentiful literature, as you will all know, in sociology about values. And we can go back to Durkheim, who understood values as essential in what society is, an essential focus of cohesion and conformity and actually of thought. He looked at the ways in which religion reaffirms, symbolizes, communicates values for a particular society. Increasingly today, people use values as a basis for identity. I'm going to talk about my research with Gen Z, and this whole talk, this whole hypothesis came from the research I did with 18 to 25-year-olds in the USA and in Britain, where they kept talking about their values. So if you say to someone, who are you? What's your identity amongst young people? They will often tell you what the values are, what their personal values are. Honesty for me is everything, they might say. So it can be a basis for your identity, increasingly, your personal identity, as well as social identity. Values are also signposts and labels. You know, when a school says, these are our values, it's saying this is the kind of thing we are. When I say, I really value honesty, I'm saying this is the kind of person I am. I'm signposting, like putting on clothes. I'm just telling you something. Often people also use the image of a compass that, you know, they give you guidance like ethics and morals. They give you some sense of how to navigate through life's choices. And of course, they're also used to regulate, to discipline, to socialize. Parents socialize children into sets of values. And that's absolutely what is done in parenting from the word go. Certain sets of values parents are trying to reinforce in their children. And they have a use as, we call this virtue signaling. You know, status, you often see on gravestones in English churches, a whole set of someone's virtues to say they were a very high status person. They were very kind, they were generous to the poor, they were faithful husband. You know, this is their status. And of course, they're often a cover for self-interest. Because they're labels, we can use them to pretend we're something when we are not something. Okay, so to my first hypothesis, and this is that values have become increasingly visible and taking over some of the roles of religion. So one example would be pride celebrations, which take place in all the countries I'm talking about now, every year and very often, and in other parts of the world too. These are celebrations of lesbian, gay, trans, queer, intersex, etc. identities. And they actually, the pride rainbow symbol, it comes from, I think, San Francisco in the 1970s, and it's spread across all these societies. It's now, this symbol is everywhere in, say, Britain. Schools have it as their flag. The pedestrian crossings in the road in London are coloured in the rainbow flag in some parts. Public buildings will fly the pride flag. It's become way more than just for lesbian, LGBTIQ people. It is a symbol of national identity and of a certain value, valuing diversity, valuing difference, and pride as a value, being good to be proud about who you uniquely are with your unique identity, including your sexual and gender and romantic identity. But values are also being used increasingly in geopolitics. I could give you, you'll think of many other examples. I just picked these for this talk. In the whole debate in Europe, a moment about Ukraine and whether Europe should be defending Ukraine against Russia. There's a lot of talk of values in Europe, and Ukraine is identifying with European values and saying, you must defend us because we are standing up for European values against Russian values. This is an argument that the EU is using a great deal. And similarly, I think this comes from a US journalist, Anna Fifield, We must stand up for our values. I think she's talking about US values. We must stand up for Taiwan because we have the same values. They also value democracy, they value individual freedom and so on. This argument is being used, values, to mobilize geopolitical alliances. It's used in the private sector as well, increasingly visible. I could pick literally any commercial company and they will have a values statement on their website. This is Microsoft. So they talk about our corporate values, which are to do with their mission, i.e. their direction, their culture, and how they treat one another, their customers, and their partners. What are their values? Respect, integrity, accountability, according to Microsoft. People who have taken antitrust movements against Microsoft might not agree with that, but that's an example of, are values real or are they window dressing? Interestingly, on these corporate values, you get a lot that's the same that companies seem to copy, but you get a lot that are distinctive. I do a little exercise with my students and I give them, I don't tell them which company it is. I just give them these lists of values like Starbucks and Microsoft and whatever. And I say, guess what company it is. And they're very good at guessing. So these values are capturing something about the brand. Schools, all schools in Britain by law have to publish their values, their school values. This is state-funded schools because in Britain, there's a competition in the state school sector, i.e. parents can have a choice about what school they send their parents to. So when you're a parent, you're trying to decide, what school do I send my child to? One of the things you will look at is what values do they have? Do I like those values? Are they my values? Do I want my child brought up in those values? Here's an example from a school website. The school values are, this is a junior school for younger children. So the values are happiness, excellence, ambition, respect, and togetherness. Do you want your child to be schooled in those values? That will help you decide whether you want to go to that school or not. Of course, there are also values conflicts. You will be familiar with the term culture wars that comes from the US. It's first used by Pat Buchanan, I think in the early 1990s. James Davison Hunter wrote this very important book about the culture wars. And then there's been a huge literature about whether they're real, whether they're imagined, if they're still ongoing, if the Trump era is a re-intensification of the culture wars and so on. But I think that we could just as well now call culture wars values conflicts or values wars. They're wars over different sets of values. And this is given a whole new lease of life in social media, in the digital age. And academics are starting to write some very good reflections on these value wars online. I've put a couple of books that I've enjoyed on that. One by Angela Nagel, Kill All Normies. She charts the early days of the internet and how values wars exploded between liberals and conservatives with 4chan for particularly young men on the and the forming of the alt-right on 4chan social media site. Whereas Tumblr became the site for left-wing liberal younger people to explore their identities, and they obviously fight. And then here's another one looking at Sunni-Shia conflict and how that gets tied up with values and is expressed online. So when I talked about the articulacy of values, they're things you can capture in a word. Of course, the digital age where we all have to express everything in a few words, I think that plays some role in how values come to be used in the way they're being used. Perhaps we might want to go back and think again about Samuel Huntington's famous book, The Clash of Civilizations. I think he's onto something similar to what I'm saying here. By a civilization, he has a loose definition of a civilization. As you know, he thinks the world is divided into a number of different civilizations, including what he calls Western, Sinic, Islamic, Japanese. He has a whole set of what he thinks are distinct civilizations. And he defines a civilization in terms of culture, religion, values. He does talk about language, ethnicity. He thinks religion is the most important of those factors in defining a civilization. So my thesis is that values are becoming more important than religion in some parts of the world. That's my thesis, if you want to put it in context of Huntington's approach. Let me give you an example. In African nations with a colonial past and a very important and a Christian profile today, contrast them with European Christian nations. They have the same religion, but they're completely at odds with each other. And that conflict comes to a head over particularly the issue of homosexuality, where the African countries like Nigeria, Ghana, for example, say that homosexuality is forbidden by God. It's contrary to the Bible and God's teaching. And the Western Christian or formerly Christian nations say that this is a high virtue, is to be diverse and allow individual expression of your identity. So same religion, but great conflict. Okay, so that was my first hypothesis about how values are becoming this new religion. And now I want to look in the second part at how and why this happened, how values supplanted religion in Western countries. And here, of course, by religion, I really chiefly mean Christianity. To some extent, I also mean the so-called, what's now called Abrahamic, but chiefly Christianity. Well, first of all, let's take a step back, because first of all, I think what happened was that Christianity itself became value-laden. Rather than focusing on doctrine, if you think about older church conflicts, medieval or early church, medieval, early modern, they were much more about doctrines, the person of Christ, the nature of God, and so on, or about the nature of the church, or about the sacraments in the Reformation. But in the modern period, churches started to become much more ethically focused, and that intensified in the 20th century. Let me give you some examples. First of all, the Roman Catholic Church. Perhaps a really clear starting point for this development is Humanae Vitae, published in 1968, that encyclical which insisted that contraception was unnatural and contrary to God's will and natural law, and proved so controversial. And then Pope John Paul II, Karol Wojtyla from Poland, was himself a moral theologian. He was an ethicist. And he wrote extensively, and he published not just books, he published more encyclicals than any other pope. And they were nearly all about ethics and values. And he defended the Catholic Church, he defended natural law. He argued the Catholic Church had absolute moral principles, absolute unchanging given moral truths that the Catholic Church preserved and handed down. And the defining issues for the Catholic Church have become not Christology, not the sacraments, but marriage and divorce, abortion, euthanasia, homosexuality, the family. So my second, and so today, if people think about being a Catholic, they think about a certain moral way of life more than believing certain doctrines. My second example is the Church of England. Fenggang mentioned I've written a book about its collapse. This was a national church. It was an ethnic church, the Church of the People of England, with obviously a colonial role to play. and it collapsed after the 1980s. It's tiny now, you know, it's struggling to survive. What happened? That's what this book's about. And one of the things that we argue happened was it became more and more, traditionally, it wasn't interested in doctrine. It thought that was a divisive. It was interested in ritual. So to be a Church of England, all you had to do was be baptized. That was it. Just be baptized and come to church occasionally for weddings and funerals, particularly. So it was a ritual church of a people. But particularly after the 1970s, like the Catholic Church, it became all about moral preaching, and it started to tell people what to do and how to behave. And it was against divorce and remarriage, and it is still against homosexuality. And that's it's not the only reason for its decline, but because society doesn't agree with those moral teachings in Britain, they're the contrary of what most people think is good. It has no, you know, it's very, for young people, it's sexist and homophobic. They wouldn't go near it. But it became a values provider. Now, some of you, if you know about Christian and theological history, you'll know that there's nothing new about saying that Christianity is primarily an ethical religion. There were people saying that in the 19th century. Hans Kung made this big declaration of a global ethic that he thought would unite the whole world, and that based on some Christian principles. So this wasn't new, but it just gathered a lot of pace after the 1970s, turning Christianity into moral, primarily about values and morality and upholding morality against the modern world. But it's a high risk strategy, because if society doesn't agree with your values, they're going to leave the church, and that's what's happened. And even worse, if you present yourself as a moral authority and then you behave badly, you just appear as a hypocrite. And this, of course, is what's happened to the church, to the Catholic Church and the Church of England and many other Protestant churches in the West. The sexual abuse scandal and cover-up. So these people who were preaching family values were actually covering up for the most appalling kind of paedophilia. This is, of course, a disaster for these churches. And just to add to this about why values become so important in secular society, alongside all this, you have had for well over 100 years in all these countries, big atheist, secular and humanist groups arguing you don't need to be religious to be moral. This argument goes back to Plato and the ancient Greeks in the West. And so many films and art and fiction are about how the good person isn't the religious person. You know, they're the secular person. And now in these societies, everyone agrees. No one would say that religious people are better people than secular people. So that argument has been won, that morality doesn't need religion. Okay, the result. Values come to judge religion. Values come to have a higher authority than religion. You judge religion, whether it's good or bad, depending on the values you see. And I mentioned, Fenggang mentioned this study, Gen Z Explained, that we carried out the research in 2018-19 on 4 college campuses, and we did big national surveys in the UK and the US, and created a big corpus of social media language. And so I'm using this data. This really informs a lot of what I'm saying in this talk. But just a few quotes from the interviews and focus groups we did. I love this quote. This quote is from a student, a young girl, a Black African-American girl who was in a Pentecostal church, and the pastor would preach against gays, and she didn't agree. And she said in the interview, "I love you, God, but I have my beliefs. So God, I love you. I'm still going to go to church, but you're wrong." And by beliefs, she means homosexuality is good. So her values are judging the pastor. Here's another quote. Religion is really looked down on in this generation, because I think people are just kind of like realizing that, well, our values conflict with a lot of religious values. And then this guy goes on, I mean, as a generation, I'd say most people believe in accepting gay people. That goes against most religions. And this generation were always defining their generation in terms of, we've got different values. We value diversity in a way our parents just don't get it. here's a quote. I won't read this. You can read, well, I will read it in case you're doing the washing up or something. My parents see things very differently. There's the perspective of a religion. They believe that God gives them what is right and wrong, whereas I just kind of have to find it for myself, whether it's within me in some kind of human nature or social interaction thing, or if it's just truly nothing, and I have to create it from the depths of my own being or something. Here you get the generational difference being spelt out in terms of values, and younger people saying, these are my values, and I don't think they come from God. And then just note how important values are. We get this quote over and over again from different people. I kind of group myself with people who share my same views. We are really alike in terms of our values. Now, this was a social media thing, because if you're online and you're looking at different social media groups, how do you know where you're going to feel comfortable? You look for the values. Often people said that. I really like this online community because they share my values. So they're very important in group identity. Final hypothesis, and I'm nearly done because I want lots of time for discussion. I also said as my second hypothesis, values have changed. How have they changed? Well, quite briefly, and we can talk more about this, but I think here again, you see the decline of a Christian influence. So what we have now in these Western countries is a live your life ethic. You can see this in a lot of American movies, for example, and it replaces an earlier give your life ethic. These are my terms. What's a live your life ethic? It means live your life. Linda, I'm unique. I've got a unique life, and I've got to live my life. Support other people who are trying to live their lives, and make a positive difference in the world from who you are. Activism has to come authentically from your life, your individual life. Now, notice this isn't left and it's not right. Both the right and the left agree on this. The alt-right agrees exactly, individual freedom, be who you are, don't be a sheep. And the right and the left wing also thinks authentic life. It crosses left and right politically. So each word in live your life counts. Living, live it, go for it is a value. It's about your unique life, and it's about life. Life becomes a value, and ecology, life, planet, and so on. So that this ethic says, I've got to live my life, you've got to live your life. It's different, and that's what the good life is. So notice implicitly there's a value of diversity here as well. Rihanna did the theme tune. This is where I got the live your life lyric from. Rihanna, the pop star, and you can get any number of popular culture things reinforce this value. So live your life, your life, your life is the refrain of her song. Don't do what other people tell you. It's got to come from you. Well, that is very different from the ethic that even I was brought up when I was young, that the churches would put forward, that teachers would put forward, which was, don't think of yourself, think of other people. Sacrifice yourself, sacrifice your needs and desires for a higher good, for God, for other people, for society, for the university, for whatever it might be. And here the values that were emphasized were service. And so there are lots of words where we have like civil service and charity. And notice they're asymmetric values. One person goes smaller so other people can be bigger. And this give your life ethic was used to justify sacrifice in the 2 world wars in Europe. To give your life was seen as the highest thing you could do. And so the war memorials in Britain are always a cross, because Jesus' sacrifice is the model for lesser Calvaries, the lesser sacrifice of all those millions of people who died in the wars. You could not use this. If you tried to send people to war today, you couldn't use these symbols or those values. It wouldn't work in exactly the same way. Final point, notice that it's not just the good that changes, evil changes too. What did we used to think was evil? Under Christian teaching in the modern period, what was evil was pride and disobeying God and selfishness. Now today what we think is evil is sexual abuse. The unspeakable crime, the person who goes outside of humanity, only since the 1990s, is the paedophile, the person who abuses children. But we also think it's very bad to be inauthentic, to not be who you truly are. So it's a complete reversal. Pride was the great sin in Christian teaching, and it becomes the value, and you have the pride celebration I began with. Now, just very briefly, this is that live your life ethic. It's not just for individuals. It also starts to influence the public sector and schools, who will also, they don't talk about service and charity now. And their highest value, we've done a big survey of their websites, is respect. And they try and encourage each individual child to live their life. In the commercial sector, the private sector, again, they don't talk about service now. We looked at Microsoft. And in politics, fundamental British values, the government put out a whole statement of what they are. Here's what they are said to be. Democracy, law, respect, individual freedom. And our big symbol in Britain of values has become the pride flag, which is identified with the National Health Service, believe it or not, which is the source of, it becomes a sort of Durkheimian symbol of caring for everyone. It's free, it's for everyone, doesn't matter how rich or poor you are, it's for diversity. Okay, let me wrap up with some general sociological reflections about the social contexts of all this. And just pulling together the threads really by way of conclusion. Obviously, secularization is, this is a lot of what I'm talking about is what used to come under the label of secularization. It's got a lot to do, the rise of values has got a lot to do with the decline of hierarchical institutional religion and its teachings. It's also got to do with the decline, the shift from hierarchical societies to mass societies, to very class-based societies, to much more democratic societies. And it's got an enormous amount to do with growing pluralism. You can't impose one set of teachings, one religion, and people have different values and different identities. It's got to do with liberal democracy as an ideology. And it's got to do with post-colonial era and becoming a multipolar world with not just one set of values or religious teachings coming from the West and seen as universal. It's got to do with capitalism. It's got to do with consumer choice and having to sell everything, including yourself and your values. It's got to do with the law, and particularly human rights law, where there is enshrined a freedom of religion or secular belief. It's got to do with the digital context, as I've explained. And it's got to do with the rise of identity as something that we all are obliged to self-define ourselves in our sorts of societies. I always like to finish with some counter evidence. Yeah, but what counts against your hypotheses? Well, there are residual Christian values. It's not like they've gone. So I think that they kind of coexist actually in the societies I'm talking about, often very uncomfortable. Like care. Care is still a value. It's a Christian value. It's essential to society, but we don't know quite how to justify it. We know it matters, but we can't justify it in terms of our values. Religious and racial aspects of identity still do matter, not just values. In other parts of the world, of course, it isn't just values. There are huge religious revivals. Perhaps religion is the most important factor, and Huntington's still right about that. And of course, you could argue these values are just, some people call it laminated, just stick them up on the wall and they're not real. I don't think that's true, by the way, but it's an objection. So to conclude, my argument has been values are a new religion. at least in the West. And I've argued that in terms of them becoming the key identity marker for individuals and groups, a focus of cohesion and of conflict. These are all things that religion used to do. If you think about each one, the point I'm trying to make is this is what religion used to do. It used to say, this is what it is to be English, Danish, American. You belong to these churches. Now it's values. Like religion used to be a focus of cohesion and conflict. Now it's values. Religion used to give people orientation and their emotional commitments. Now it's values. Religion used to provide rituals and symbols. Now values are starting to do that, like the pride symbols and values, rituals. And values provide something bigger than you, meaning, compass, self-transcendence. However, with my final note, as people who are all interested in religion, we all know religion isn't just values. It never was. Perhaps the churches overemphasize values, but there's a lot more to religion than just values. So there are still some things that values don't capture, particularly connection to gods, spirits, and powers. And these are just as important, including in the West, as they ever were, but they float free from the churches. And so what you get is a rise in magical interest in magic and spirituality, which doesn't tend to preach values, but does give you direct connection with spiritual powers. But religion itself declines. That's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Linda. This is a very stimulating talk. Now we are open for questions. I will moderate questions.
Thank you.
If anyone has any question, you may raise your hand using the Zoom function. If you see there's a reaction at the bottom, and you click it, there's a hand. You just click that hand so that I can see you have a question. Or you type up your question in the chat area. Then I'll call your attention to either speak or I'll read your question. Before moving, I want to say just it's stimulating, made me immediately thinking about the so-called Asia values, as suggested by the former president of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew. He began talking about Asian values several decades ago. And also in China, the Chinese Communist Party put out the socialist core values that suppose all Chinese in the PRC, the People's Republic of China, should share. And schools even teach about these core values.
When was that? When was that?
This is at least in the last decade or more. And under the current president, Xi Jinping, certainly that is really entered the school curriculum. And it's also in social media and the major media. So the values as new religion. And a question I have, that's a comment, but a question I do want to put out, what do you think about the Christian nationalism? Is that a value over religion? Yeah, that's a question, and I'll stop there. And
Christian nationalism where, Fenggang?
Especially in the U.S., it's clearly,
the US.
But it's broader. I think there are supporters of Christian nationalism from Asia, from East Asia, for this American Christian nationalism.
I think in the US, the Christian nationalism, which is evangelical Christianity, is kind of very melded with that kind of nationalism in the US and not in Europe. And it's it is very much about Christianity becomes a symbol for a set of values rather than the Christian doctrines aren't what's talked about. So when it's talked about what is Christianity in those contexts, it's about certain values of individual freedom and the family, and sometimes about whiteness, or about, you know, the original an ethnic identity. So I do think that's highly values laden, and it kind of uses Christianity as a carrier and a symbol and a shorthand and a way of holding that together. And that's why you see young people in the US, many young people leaving the churches, non-religion growing very quickly, and they all say they don't like those values.
Okay, thank you. I see David Palmer raised a hand. David Palmer is a professor of sociology at Hong Kong University. David?
Yes, so thank you so much, Professor Woodhead. This actually really, it's an extremely thought-provoking proposal to talk about the rise of values as, in a sense, the new form of religion in Western countries and maybe elsewhere. And so I was just thinking about a number. I just had 3 questions related to that. The first one is, I was just wondering how this relates to the notion of spirituality, and I know you've written about that too. So spirituality is another form of moving out of religion into a more vague form of spiritual values. So so how does this conceptualization of values and moving from religion into values relate to conceptualizations or theories of moving from religion to spirituality? So this is my first question. And my second question is kind of methodological, because it seems that there are 2 things that we're talking about here. One is what things are doing or talking about, even though they might not call those things values, but we may as outsiders say, oh, when you're talking about pride, when you're talking about LGBT rights or individual freedom, you're talking about values. But then there's the other side, which is when groups are explicitly generating a discourse on values. So when you have the corporate consultants and the educational very explicitly saying these are our values, and they have workshops that are all about, and in fact, I've been involved in helping scholars run workshops for corporations on identifying their values and things like that. And so, and this is something quite widespread in various kinds of fields. So this is quite explicit. So groups that they have notions of values, and then they want to promote a discourse on values. And so then some of the examples you're talking about are, you see how that percolates into then people's everyday speech when these young people are saying, well, these values, so they're using a language of values. But some of the things that you're talking about, I don't know if they're actually talking in a language of values, and others are people who are talking in the language of values. So I'm just wondering, how do we, how do we relate these 2 things, or what would be your thoughts about that? And I guess the third question is, what are the institutional kind of formations that are propelling these kinds of transformations, in a sense? Because I don't think this is or I don't know actually, but it's not only just some spontaneous change in relation to modernity and post-modernity, the values kinds of orientations or discourse are popping up all over, but that there are, as I've seen in the field of education, in the field of management, right, in various kinds of political discourses. So there's an institutionalized promotion of a discourse on values. And so actually it just made me think, because I kind of noticed that in the field of education and management, but I'm wondering actually if it goes much farther, like what are the institutional underpinnings of, groups and institutions and discursive kind of formations that are actively promoting a kind of values-oriented secularization or values-oriented kind of resacralization of society in a certain way. So yeah, these were just some questions that were coming to my mind.
Right, they're very probing questions, thank you. On the first one, spirituality, where does that fit in? Because some people, you know, I mean, you can make the same argument about spirituality, that it took over from religion, but and we wrote a book called The Spiritual Revolution, but actually we're never arguing that spirituality took over from religion. We argue that it was making up about 2.5% of the population in that book. I think the title gave people the wrong, but that was going to be, our argument was that was going to be bigger than the churches in 50 years time, which is coming true in Britain. But I would say that spirituality it's always a subcultural movement. It's not a mass movement in societies. It gets it gets picked up in advertising and so on, you know, yoga and whatever, but it's still that really active people are a minority in Western societies, and it is a successor of religion. You know, people say I'm spiritual, not religious. They are wanting to keep the connection with something bigger, with spirits. And they are, you know, they're religious virtuosi. They're interested in spiritual aspects of life, much more than values. So I don't think that spirituality is values. And you can see this now as spirituality has matured and proliferated. You've got very right-wing pagan groups, increasingly. Some of the alt-right. You know, look at the storming of the Capitol. You get alt-right spiritual, the shaman and so on. And you have left-wing spiritual groups. So the values can go, spirituality can grab lots of different values. It's not inherently a values movement. It's driven by a different imperative, I think, which is much more about magic and spirituality and enchantment. So I see values as a much, much bigger cultural phenomenon, which has as big a role as the church is used to in these societies. Which, let me go straight to your third question, because I think that the churches in these Western societies used to provide a kind of grab bag of symbols, ideas, concepts, stuff you could take and use it in your school, use it in your business, use it in your mottos, use it in your materials. And now that's what values do. They do the same thing. So they've taken the place of the churches much more directly than Christianity has, but not the religious function, not the specifically supernatural functions, not at all. Because it's got to be secular as well as, you know. And your second question is a more sociological one, I think, about kind of structural change. And as you were saying it, I was thinking what you're describing is exactly what I think is happening. So you've got this movement is a silent revolution. It wasn't driven like it wasn't like the Reformation. It wasn't driven by a few leaders, and then you know you get some organizations of religious and political power and alliances. No, not at all. It kind of silently happened. So like the most important social changes, it comes from the ground up and the top down. You know, businesses get into it, states get into it, but people are already doing it. Teachers are already doing it. You know, it's coming from top and bottom together at the same time. And that's what makes it so powerful. And mutually reinforcing as those things happen.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question put in the chat. Let me read this for you. This is from Professor Ray Wang at the National Chengchi University in Taipei. He asked, even you talked about values in the West. I'm wondering if you can comment on the issue of universal values, since it is a hot topic debate, especially between China and the West right now.
That's a really interesting observation. Whether there are such things, I doubt. But there is there's a very important cultural history of people claiming universal values, which of course has a very strong, colonial powers claimed to be taking universal values and justifying what they were doing in terms of bringing these real values to other parts of the world. The Catholic Church claims that it has universal values. Many different groups and countries claim they have universal values. It's a way of sort of turbocharging your values by saying they're universal values that apply everywhere. And then you get the clash of universal values. Huntington has a chapter on that. It doesn't seem to go away, this.
Okay, thank you. Another question in chat by Chen Wen-San. The question is, in one of your slides, you mentioned that care was important in Christianity. However, it could hardly be considered as one of the emerging values. Can you explain more about that?
Yeah, I'm very interested in this. I haven't written about it, but care is a Christian concept and word. And it's very embedded in our societies, not just as a word, but in institutional forms. There are care homes where we look after elderly people or disabled people or whatever. And it's connected with the word charity as well. Well, the word charity has gone out of fashion. So charity shops don't call themselves charity shops anymore. That Christian word it sounds too hierarchical, you know, paternalistic. Somebody giving to somebody lower down. But care is asymmetric. It's a Christian value and it's asymmetric. The carer cares for someone who is in need. And it doesn't really fit with our live your life value. And yet we still need to do this in society. You know, parents need to care for babies. When we get old, someone has to care for us. It's crucial work. And there are quite a lot of books by political theorists and so on saying, look, this care work in society, it's invisible. It's not paid enough. It's often done, you know, obviously the whole literature as well, on, you know, for example, Filipino migrant doing work for rich people in the West and so on. It's invisible because the value isn't one that we value it, but we don't value it. It's not part of our system. So it's got this really strange position, very uncomfortable, unhealthy position in these societies, care work.
Okay, thank
you. It's
you.
a crisis, a social crisis, as well as a cultural one.
Okay. All right, next, Professor Francis Song has a question. Raise your hand.
Right, okay. Thank you very much for your very, very insightful speech. My question is about the kind of values, you see. There might be weak values or the strong values. When we are thinking about some very, very important, significantly important life situations, then we usually, depending upon the process of the strong evaluation process. And but my view is that when you are talking about your thesis, your notion about the values, I think it belongs rather to the weak values. This is my point of view. Usually these weak value systems could be made through the so-called online digital dissemination process, like SNS, you see. So that means, in that respect, I think those kind of values are vulnerable to changeable, depending upon the very difficult life situations. So, that's my point of view. So, what do you think about that?
Two things. First of all, the young people we interviewed think it's a good thing that their values can change. And they often say, you know, this is flexible. I might be different when I'm older, but at the moment, these are my values. So they see that flexibility as a good thing, point one. Point two, I think you're right in sort of philosophical terms. So values actually in practice are what you do. That's strong values. So everyone seems to have nice values. I mean, take an academic department. You know, everyone has to say they have nice values. When there's a real conflict, you see what people's true values are. Where will they go? Who do they side with? So we all wait to see somebody faced with a critical decision, and will they do a good thing or this value? You know. So in practice, our strong values are what we enact. They're what we live out. They're what we do even when it's costly to us. And you can only see that in behavior. but we also articulate them. And the articulation also matters because it helps us realize what our values are and try and reflect on them. You know, we're reflective beings, I suppose. So I think there are these two levels. So the values revolution I'm talking about, you're quite right, is about the increasing articulation of values. It doesn't mean to say we've become a better people or better society, but we're much more making visible these values and giving them more weight in society that way.
All right, we are running out of time. These are very interesting questions and comments, and especially thank you for this very provocative speech. Let's have a round of applause. Thank you, and the program continues, and this speech and the Q&A is also recorded. For those who didn't get the whole thing, later on you'll get the information of where you can watch the video recording. Okay, thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for
Thank you, Professor Woodhead.
Yeah, thank you very much. You did great the speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Great talk.